Hi, I haven't posted in a while. I recently returned from New Mexico, having spent I left in September, most of the month of October leading a vision quest. And most of that time I was in wilderness without any connection to the internet, so I really haven't posted in a while. I was there over Columbus Day, which has recently been relabeled and repackaged as Indigenous Peoples Day. And I just wanted to speak about and address some of the assumptions, mostly incorrect, that people make about human nature and are then projected onto Indigenous people. The concept of the, quote, noble savage was inspired by the European colonists' discovery of the indigenous peoples of the Americas, or the oceanic islands and Africa. And this idea of the noble savage was popularized by the Swiss philosopher Rousseau and adopted by the partisans of the French Revolution. And it asserted that humans, uncorrupted by civilization, are selfless, peaceful, and serene. And they're morally superior to those who inherit all the troubles, like violence, wars, greed, and anxiety, that are the products of civilization. At the time, mostly in the 1700s, this challenged and competed with an older stream of thought that all humans had dark impulses that, if not tamed, resulted in a brutal and savage life, and that therefore proper child rearing involved training the intellect and fostering a healthy respect for authority. About a year ago, a friend of mine posted Happy Indigenous Peoples Day in early October, in which he told the story of Columbus's meeting with the Arawak, or sometimes called the Taino people, and Columbus's evaluation of them as noble, friendly people who would, quote unquote, make good slaves. This post represented the tendency to see Europeans, white, civilized, and colonial, as morally evil, and the indigenous people as noble and good. But in terms of the actual facts of the matter, the reason Columbus first encountered the Arawak people was because they had been driven north out of the islands of the Lesser Antilles by the Carib Indians, who were much more warlike. And the Carib raided, captured, and otherwise preyed upon the Arawak, torturing, killing, and eating the men, and taking the women as slave wives to bear children, because the children were considered great delicacies. So, somehow, no one ever holds up the Carib Indians as bearers of indigenous wisdom. I think today, a lot of people seem to have a really hard time accepting the shadow sides of human nature, whether that be greed and self-interest or human aggression and violence. We want to see these qualities as somehow mistaken, as aberrations, the things that could be weeded out if we didn't have capitalism, or if we practiced better child rearing, or we weren't infected with the scourge of racism. But the data about indigenous peoples does not support this position. The evidence actually shows that peaceful clans in the indigenous world were really rare, and they were considerably outnumbered by the more warlike and deadly bands. The Yanomamo of the Amazon rainforest, for example, were committed to continuous warfare and raiding, and the men who acquired more kills were rewarded with more wives and hence more offsprings. In Samoa, Margaret Mead found that the more warlike tribes generally inhabited the better and more arable land, and therefore were more likely to survive. And John Perkins, the founder of the Dream Change Institute, who lived among the Shuar, the last headhunters of the Amazon for many years, has spoken about how when the Ecuadorian government outlawed their constant warfare, their population increased dramatically to the point where the jungle could no longer support their traditional way of life. In other words, living in ecological balance was dependent on a constant state of conflict. Now, I'm certainly not saying this to disparage indigenous culture or indigenous people in any way. My life has been positively impacted in major ways by the North American native teachers, Sun Bear, Wallace Black Elk, and Raymond Stone, who I've studied or spent time with. And I honor and respect other teachers like Brant Secunda, who's been adopted into Huichol lineage and has shared it with the wider world. But I do take issue with the denial of human nature and trying to reshape humanity while turning whole classes of people into good or evil. Because this is basically a recipe for totalitarianism, whether it be Nazis, Marxists, or something else. Karl Marx taught, and this is a quote, that the alteration of men on a mass scale is necessary for change. While Hitler spoke of the will to create mankind anew. Each of those points of view epitomizes an unwillingness to accept human beings as the complex and shadow-filled beings they are, and a desire to condemn and eliminate a whole group of people, certain races for Hitler, and certain classes for Marx, in order to purify humanity. One can love and respect indigenous wisdom, a wisdom that works for and within the world that indigenous people live in. But we can also affirm and respect civilized wisdom, as expressed in the mythologies and philosophies of Greece, the sculpture and paintings of Michelangelo, the plays of Shakespeare, the mathematical and scientific brilliance of Einstein, and the political philosophies that have led to the never-before expressed freedom of speech and expression that we take for granted today. Wisdom, along with temperance, courage, and justice, was the cardinal virtue of the ancient Western world. A rich and soulful life was the result of practicing the virtues that led to wisdom. And wisdom is what works in the world in which you live. And if you're reading or listening to this post or watching it, you live in a civilized world, and not an indigenous one. And it is a wise choice to practice those virtues like gratitude and hope, that can bring you joy and can make you and all of us resilient and strong. Aho.